Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, John. Hi, Ed. How are you guys?
Hello, hello,
Good.
hello.
Good. And Donna, I saw you came in. How wonderful to see everybody once again.
Been a long time.
Yeah, it has been. Lawrence, Michael, John, Donna, Errol. Wonderful to see all of you once again.
Thank you.
Hope that
Thank
you've
you.
had a relatively great holiday season. And now that we've got spring upon us, yay. We're in for a real treat tonight. So we'll have a few moments of chit chat here, and then we will get started at 7:30 with our program. We're expecting about 40 people to come in today, so we're really pleased that everybody could join us. So John Cowgill, you've been out and about.
Yep, and I'll be leaving in a few weeks. Not doing as much railroad stuff this trip. The only railroad stuff I'll be doing is hopefully the National Transportation Museum in St. Louis, possibly Union Station if time allows, and a miniature train town in Arkansas.
Great.
And maybe some sites in Tennessee and Kentucky.
Okay, well, I just don't want to be a spoiler, John.
Yeah.
But Bill and Jack are going to show you a place you cannot visit.
Okay.
So I just want you to be aware that.
Oh yeah, they usually when they say I cannot visit, I don't visit.
But it had me drooling when we went through our dry run. It was like, oh, I want to go there. Oh no, you can't, Dan. Hi, Dorothy. How are you?
I guess Dorothy's not on, or is she?
Oh, she's here. She's just on mute. She'll be coming in a minute.
Yeah. I'm trying to debate whether or not to go to the Baltimore chapter banquet next weekend
Okay.
up at B&O Museum.
What's stopping you from going?
I'm just on the fence. I mean, I'm leaning more towards going.
Okay.
They could meet some other people.
Okay. And Dorothy, we saw your mouth going, but we didn't hear you. So no, we're still not hearing you, Dorothy. Can you hear us? Okay, we want to make sure that you can hear us so that you get Bill and Jack's full presentation. How wonderful. We've got Renee joining us. Bob, Peter. So good to see all of you folks.
Nice to see you too.
We've missed everybody. We've missed seeing everybody. Our mission within the DC NRHS chapter is to expand the public appreciation of railroads and their history through preservation and education. And we accomplish that through many different programs. The first is we sponsor a high school student to rail camp. Second, we operate the beloved Dover Harbor that is going to Chicago this year for Pullman Days, so there's still room. We maintain a railroad library at the Bowie Tower in Maryland, and we publish the newsletter, The Timetable, monthly. Another way we do that is by offering these free programs by Zoom. Tonight, our speakers are Bill Hakkarainen and General Jack Griffith. Bill is a member of DC NRHS, and some of you may know him from his volunteer activities on the Dover Harbor. Bill is a retired family physician and former volunteer at the B&O Railroad Museum. General Jack Griffith retired from the U.S. Air Force, where he was the first director of operations and logistics for the United States Transportation Command at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. Under his leadership, all military service movements were organized under a single unified command. Now, tonight, they will be discussing two past military railroad programs, including the rail-based mobile flight simulator program for the Strategic Air Command and the military railroad at Fort Eustace, Virginia. And so tonight, let's settle in and let Bill and Jack take us on a historic ride of the military use of the railroads. Over to you, Bill and Jack.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see everybody here. I'm very glad to have General Jack Griffith with me. He has insisted that I'm to do the play-by-play and he is to do the color. So if you have to understand that as we get into the presentation. What you're seeing on the screen now should be a map of the Confederacy with its railroads. And the reason for that is actually the Civil War was when railroads began to be an important part of the military. You've all heard of the great locomotive chase, but as you can see here, most of the South was 5-foot gauge. Now, military railroads during the Civil War were used, of course, for transporting troops and transporting supplies, but they also transported guns and cannon like this one. There's some famous pictures that come from the Civil War. This picture at Hanover Junction, and I'm going to use my pointer here, supposedly shows Abraham Lincoln on his way to either to or from the Gettysburg Address, but nobody's really sure that that's the case. But that site at Hanover Junction still exists, and the Northern Central Railroad has done an interesting juxtaposition of its current train on the right and the original picture on the left. And I think this does look down here more like Abe Lincoln. But the Civil War is what made the railroads important in warfare, and that's when the United States military railroad began. Now, my own personal exposure to military railroading happened in about 1962. I was on vacation in Negaunee, Michigan, not too far from Marquette, where there was a new Air Force base being built, K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base. And I was out taking train pictures, as is my wont, and I came across this car. And I thought this was the neatest thing I'd ever seen. It was all painted silver. It was labeled U.S. Air Force. It had their Strategic Air Command banner on it. And I had no idea what it was. I said, gee, are they transporting missiles? Is it hauling bombs? What exactly is it? And it kind of stayed a mystery to me until I moved here to this Broadmead retirement community and met General Jack Griffith. And he was quick to tell me after I showed him the picture, not only did he know what it was, he had been in charge of some of them in his role as Director of Transportation for the Strategic Air Command. So this was, Jack, this picture is dated 1961. Is that when they started?
You ask tough questions, Bill. No, they started in the late 50s and early 60s. So I don't have an exact date.
Okay, but this is close to it. This is a copy of a newspaper article, and they're talking about the KC-135 flight simulator. But then Jack went and told me that they actually had flight simulator trains. 18 of them, am I correct?
Yes. These trains were the simulator cars were put together by the Air Force at the Ogden Air Logistics Center at Hill Air Force Base. and they were fabricated with two Pullman cars that I'm not sure where the Air Force acquired them, but the two Pullman cars, and then the simulator guts, if you will, in the middle. The cars were used both as classroom and as quarters for the crew that maintained the equipment. Remember these times; these were well before the resistor transistor. Everything was vacuum tube technology, so it required a lot of space, a lot of air conditioning. But these were the first of 18 that eventually were fabricated there at Hill Air Force Base.
Here's what the simulator looked like actually inside. This is a KC-135 simulator, I believe. It did not have the same kind of motion that flight simulators have today. And Jack had told me that every pilot back then thought it was better to fly than to be in a simulator.
They still think that.
They still think that.
Yeah. Yeah,
But,
this.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, these simulators were very surprising in the fact that the crews that were operating them actually began to feel the motion just as though it were an in-motion simulator. Don't know how that transpired. I think it was a surprise to everyone when it did, but they really were very realistic. And again, for the time, well ahead of anything else.
Here's a little closer view of the cockpit of the simulator.
And that's a very accurate depiction of.
Now they've all gone out of service, obviously, but the Air Force did save two, and these are the two that are in a cross pattern at the Fairchild Air Force Base. However, they're not, this base and this museum is not at this point open to the public. So this is the place that a rail fan can't visit. But we got the next best way was to use Google Earth and see what they look like from Google Earth. And there you can see them. There's also a B-52 in there. There's some jets, an F-86. But again, it's at this point, this airfield, this air park is not open to the public. Well, that was my first surprise about military railroading. This is the pause point after talking about the simulators to take any questions that come. I see one in the chat. Am I going to read the chat, or are you guys going to read the chat?
I'll help you read the chat. Michael asks that in the simulator photo that you showed, it looks like it's 8 throttle handles.
Yes, that's correct.
And suggesting that was a simulator for the B-52.
That's correct.
Michael,
Well, take the general's word for it. I'm wrong.
yeah, Michael, you're on fire, man. There is a question about how were the simulators powered and where was the power?
I'm not sure that I can fully answer the question.
Did it plug into the wall or?
Well, no, there were generators so that they were self-sufficient.
Right.
There's a simulator at Air Force Base in Dayton. I didn't find that in my research, but I wouldn't doubt it.
I don't know that. I think the Air Force Museum has has one car, but I'm not sure of that.
Well, thanks,
Okay.
Bob. That's something to investigate. Michael again asks, how did the appearance of the simulator trains compare with the radar bomb scoring trains?
I'm not sure I understand the question. How did the visual compare?
I think that might be what Michael's talking about. Michael, do you want to unmute and ask the question verbally? We'll come
I'm
back.
always impressed with how much rail fans know, because I personally do not know what a radar bomb scoring RBS train is.
Well, I think essentially the bomb scoring train was one car with the necessary radar and other equipment to score electronically the electronic bombing conducted by the B-52s on a range, but
Okay.
I was not involved in that.
Okay. Well, that's what we have for now. So back to
Okay,
you,
so
Bill.
I'm going to move along to my next military railroad discovery. And that was, again, by virtue of being a Washington, D.C. chapter member. In 1970, the chapter ran a special train from Washington Union Station down to Fort Eustace to ride the United States Military Railroad that was there operating at Fort Eustis, and in 1970 was still running multiple steam locomotives. Now that's quite a railroad. Here's a map, not to scale, but it does have everything you'd want to see in a major railroad. It had locomotive shops, a yard, towers, bridges, and a connection, of course, to the C&O main line at Lee Hall, Virginia. So the next series of things we're going to talk about is what that trip was like. And here's the headquarters for the 714th Transportation Battalion. Now, these pictures in black and white were taken by Ron Peterson, who at the time was a soldier at the base and in the Army service in terms of railroading. And he graciously shared these with me. I was hoping he could be with us tonight, but he's retired as well and on vacation. But there was actually 3 companies there at the battalion. Company A was track repair. Company B was locomotive and car repair. And Company C was the operating company. The headquarters was Hank's Yard. And Jack, you know Hank, or knew Hank, right?
I did. I first met General Small when he was a 2-star general, and I was a major serving on the joint staff of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was commander of the Army's Military Traffic Management Command, but he was also chief of the United States Army Transportation Corps, whose colors are the red and gold that you'll see throughout the presentation on the later day trains.
Here's what Hank's Yard looked like. This is again in 1970 or 1971. The Army had multiple types of cars, passenger cars, freight cars, cabooses, just about every kind of car you could imagine, because one of the functions of the base at Fort Eustis was to train the Army soldiers who were assigned to operate trains, to operate railroads. These were military soldiers and military railroaders. Here's the locomotive shop. Outside is one of the MRS-1 EMD locomotives. This again is from Ron Peterson's pictures in the early 70s. And here's what the inside looked like. Now, we didn't get in there when we had our DCNRHS trip, but we still had an awful lot of fun. Here's the Y Tower on the map. Again, picture of Ron Peterson. And here's our train. This is the train that brought the DC chapter and other passengers right onto the base at Camp Lejeune. The cars were Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac, Seaboard, and Atlantic Coastline. And we had RF&P diesels as far as Doswell. And then these two CNO passenger-equipped Jeeps took over to take us right onto the base. Our power on our train at the base were two of these 280 consolidations. This is the USATC, United States Army Transportation Corps, S-160 class. This interesting locomotive had been built for heavy freight work in Europe during World War II, and was also sent all over the world. A total of 2,120 of these were built. A number of them still exist today, some in tourist service. I'll mention that as we go along. Our lead locomotive here, number 607, and our second locomotive was number 612. .607 actually is the only locomotive that still is preserved at the museum that continues to exist at Fort Eustace. Here we are getting ready for our trip. The cars are former U.S. Army hospital cars. Some of these actually went on to serve on Amtrak as cafe and club cars. I can remember riding in them. They weren't particularly comfortable passenger cars. They mainly had bunks in them, and we sat on bunks. But here we are getting ready to take off, and the smoke is building as the passengers are starting to board. The best thing for steam locomotive fans is to have a run-by, and the Army did a good job. Here's one of the ones that we saw, and they gave quite a steam and sound show. Well, we actually got there and got our trip done just in time, because the summer of we were there in October 1970. 1971 was not a good year for Army steam. This 611 had been stored out on a spur, and they needed some parts from it, so they sent the switcher out to tow it to the steam shop. They had taken the crosshead off on the fireman's side, and the main rod was just cabled up to the crosshead guide. But on the way the cable was cut, the main rod fell to the ground just before one of the bridges, got stuck in the ground, lifted the locomotive up on four wheels, and rotated it to the rear. The crew got it stopped on the bridge, and Ron Peterson was there to get these pictures. Here's another picture from the end of the cab. The other sister locomotive, 612, also had some hard times. The engine locked up. The front wedge that holds the crosshead to the piston head was so worn that it stuck to the side rod of the number one driver. And members of the company B had to move the engine into the shop, drop all the wheels, and rebuild driving boxes, shoes, and wedges. And Ron Peterson was there to get some of these photos as well. These are pictures that we don't usually see steam locomotives in this condition. However, we weren't the only run-bys and tours that the railroad had done. These are pictures that Ron took prior to our visit, and again, showing the activity and the action of steam run-bys. .606 here before it underwent all of its rebuilding of its wheels and associated structures. They even had a triple header. I don't know exactly what the date of this was. Again, it was prior to our visit in 1970, but it was very clear that the members of the U.S. military railroad had a real appreciation for how to show off their work and their importance of dealing with the public. Here's 606. This is the one that had much of the difficulty. 606 actually has been preserved, and 606 now can be found in Crewe, Virginia. And here it is. It's been relabeled Norfolk and Western, but that's actually U.S. Army 606. It's a small museum there in Crewe, but as you can see, it's very well kept. This one, your traveling itinerant traveler can go and visit. 607, the one that was on our train, here's several pictures of it, because it ended up being the last functioning steam locomotive there at Fort Eustace. Pictures of it with the new diesels that were coming in. These again are from the early 1970s or late 1960s, taken by Ron. And 607 was a very trim locomotive, a very pretty locomotive. And as I said, it's now in the museum at Fort Eustace, the Army Transportation Museum, and we'll see a picture of it later. Another locomotive that was, passing on 610. 610 has also been preserved. 610 can now be found at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum, along with 4501 and 630. And it's been restored and is active and in service. And here it is at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum, also visible and can be visited by the public. Here we have at the Age of Steam Roundhouse in Ohio, number 612. They are in. This is not complete yet, but they have done a wonderful job of restoration. I don't know if that green paint is prototypical, but it certainly makes for a very attractive Army steam locomotive. The Great Smoky Mountain Railroad in North Carolina has preserved this locomotive, originally from the Reeder Railroad. But again, this is one of those 2,000 plus that were built, and they were built by all manufacturers. Some of them were built by Lima, some were built by Alco, some were built by Baldwin. Now, there was one other locomotive in steam when we visited. This is a picture taken by Ron, but in addition to 607, you can see the tank engine number 714. That was used at the base for Santa Claus trains and frequent small passenger trains, again, for the public and for the families of soldiers. Now, 714 has an interesting history. Here it is being serviced down at the base. This locomotive began life in Washington, D.C., shuffling coal cars for the St. Elizabeth Hospital. After its service at Fort Eustace, it moved here to Baltimore. And here's my friend Jim Reeves, a fellow volunteer and trainmaster, servicing number 4, its original number, but that's 714 from the Army days. And when B&O fired it up, it put on a good show as well. This would be the early 1990s. And number 4 handled itself well. Excuse me, this is about 2002, not 1990s. Number 4 handled itself well and could actually take 4 B&O passenger cars, former Mark I coaches, on the excursion on the museum grounds. This locomotive is put in here. This is actually an LSNI 280. Rail fans will know these 280s as having gone to the Grand Canyon Railroad and having gone to Western Maryland Scenic. It's put in here because the Strategic Air Command actually used some of these locomotives for target practice. I don't know if they used this one per se, but it's put in there to make that comment that not all the 280s survived in tourist service. Some of them became good targets. 280 number 23 ended up working on the Marquette and Huron Mountain Tourist Railroad in Upper Michigan. And of course, the one we all know here in the Washington-Baltimore area, number 734 up at the Western Maryland Scenic, is also a former LSNI 280. Well, now let's look at today's Army. Here's the, Jack mentioned the red and orange colors of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, or United States Transportation Corps. This picture is taken from the window of the Crescent in Anniston, Alabama. So you can actually see these locomotives right as you're going your way. Next time the Dover Harbor goes to New Orleans, take a look as you go through Anniston. Another view again from the other angle as the Crescent was passing. They can still be found in Utah. This is out near Ogden. This was taken on a trip out to visit my son and his family. And I was very pleased and surprised to see the Transportation Corps is still working out in Utah. And here's 2 in Denver. Ron Peterson sent me this picture of a ceremony. He did not say what the ceremony was. It almost looks like it might be a shutdown or closing ceremony because the railroad actually stopped working at Fort Eustace in 1972. They decided that wasn't that much interest or importance of soldiers to learn railroading, and the entire railroad and part of the base shut down. Now, those who've been reading Trains magazine know that that's not the case now, and it's actually coming back. But here's another of those original U.S. Army MRS-1s. This is at the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis. I heard somebody in the group say they had a trip planned out there. Jack couldn't tell me for sure that he knew if there were any Air Force locomotives left. I found this one at the Ogden, at the museum, Utah State Transportation Museum in Ogden, Utah. It looks like it needs a lot of work. My time in the military was at Camp Lejeune in early 1970s, 73 to 75. And there was a railroad at Camp Lejeune, and it used this is not my photo, but this is the type of locomotive, and this is the railroad at Camp Lejeune. Lots of these small diesels were used by the Army. This is at Picatinny Arsenal. They were a very popular locomotive to use on base for shuffling cars on base. Okay, so what's the military doing with trains today? This picture was shared with me with permission to use, and this is just taken last year, 2023. This is a train of tanks leaving Dallas. The photographer thought they might be destined to the Ukraine. Now, I don't know what kinds of armaments we're sending to Ukraine and when, so I don't know if it's true, but there are still plenty of trains of military vehicles crossing the country. This is an interesting slide or picture because it also shows one of the risks of current rail photography. This is a drone picture, and more of us rail enthusiasts are using drones with cameras to take photographs. And if you look at the top, there's another drone up there. So pretty soon, sooner or later, it's going to happen that some rail fan photographer taking a picture is going to have a collision of his drone with another rail fan drone. Another train of tanks. These are given by Eric. Can't read Eric's last name on here, but with his permission. And you'll never know if you're going to find a tank like this crossing the road when a freight train passes you. But the military and its transportation, particularly of large vehicles, is still important. Here's one of my own pictures. This is Sherman Hill in Wyoming. This was about 1984, and I was very surprised to see this military train coming up the west slope of Sherman Hill towards the summit.
Bill, if I may.
Go ahead.
There may be a better place later, but I would make a comment or two about the military's use of railroads.
Please do.
We absolutely rely on the railroads anytime we deploy units from the United States overseas. When we deploy a division, it takes 60 or 70 train loads to move the equipment that can only be moved by train in the United States from their garrison to the ports. So this is not an uncommon situation at all to see the trains of this magnitude heading across country. There's an armored division, for example, at Fort Hood, Texas, when it deploys either on exercise or to swap divisions out, moves everything they own by train across country to a port, usually to Houston, Galveston area, but it could be onto one of the East Coast ports. So a great reliance on the civilian railroads on the part of the U.S. military. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Here's that same train coming further up the hill. Those who know military equipment better than I could probably identify what each of these vehicles are. I, being the rail fan, was more interested in the motive power. Okay, well, today, the Fort Eustace still maintains a museum, and here's 607 from our trips back in 1970, and it's in pretty good shape in the museum. The museum can be visited by the public. You have to sign in and show identification, and I know that at Christmas time they even have Santa Claus trains and trips again, and the military has started again with an operation. Army rail operators prepare for a new role, it said. There's an article in Trains Magazine recently. It's now the 226th Transportation Railway Operating Company from Chicopee, Mass. Was down there. So it's a training site for other reserve sites, and it also uses some civilians in train operation. Also in the museum was this interesting crane. United States Army probably spent much of its time out at Hanks Yard, but the museum also has some of these large military vehicles besides railroading. But what I thought was one of the neatest things was the Army's version of a caboose. Here's the appears larger than what we're used to in the civilian world, and a pretty impressive vehicle in my opinion. There's now a military railroad society, and they have formed, and their mission is to try and preserve the function and preserve the memory of the great use of the railroads in World War II and much of the hardware that goes with it. You can find them on the internet by doing a search for Army Steam, and you'll come up with their website. And I know that they very, very much would like to get their number 714, B&O's number 4, back to Fort Eustace. But at any rate, it seems that Fort Eustace is still going to be a site for railroad historians to be interested in. And I was, during our rehearsal, I was saying maybe the Washington, D.C. chapter might want to give some thought to having another trip down to Fort Eustace like they did in 1970. But then the realities of real life come to play. Well, maybe it could be a bus trip. But at this point, this completes our discussion of what we know about the military and railroading at this point, and we'll move to the next series of questions from the chat.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Jack. We do have some questions, and maybe more will be coming in. The question about the crews on the regular railroads who we're back to talking about the simulators. Were there special rules for the crews of the railroads who pulled the simulators around? Or were all of the railroad crews Air Force employees?
None were, none,
Okay.
in my life, none were Air Force employees. All the train crews were the crews of the railroad, particular railroad that was moving the simulators. The simulators were protected by armed Air Force security personnel who rode inside the one of the cars as it was being shuttled from base to base. And I think I had mentioned earlier that some of the rules of the movement was that the cars could not be humped. They had to be special handled in the yards where the humping occurred because of the shock of the hump operation. The cars or the simulators essentially were retired in the late 80s. I think 89 was probably the last use of the rail simulators for two reasons. One, the miniaturization of the avionics, electronics, reduced the need for such a large train setup, the Pullmans. And two, whereas the Air Force originally had over 700 B-52s scattered all around the country, by the early 1990s, they were down to 70 or 80 or so, and now they're down to 68, with half of those being in the reserve or the Air National Guard. So the requirement for the simulators to be moved simply does not exist anymore.
So you were saying the other day that most of the simulators now are land-based at the bases, and they don't have a need to move. They move the pilot
Yes,
to the base.
and today's simulator is a far cry from these. If you go into a base that has a simulator, they're full motion simulators. You can stand outside and watch the thing go through all the motions that it would experience in the air. Everything from takeoff to landing to all the events that pilots hate, but that the instructors induce to cause them to react to situations that they're not expecting.
Great, thank you. There was a question about the relationship between the transportation companies at Fort Eustace and the Army Reserve Railway Unit. And Bill, you mentioned that there was some Massachusetts units coming down to Fort Eustace. This question is relating to Middletown, Connecticut, and are the Connecticut units coming down to Eustace to do their active duty rail training? So could you
I
speak
can't
about?
speak to that specifically, but I can quote from the Defense Visual Information Distribution Service that says Army Reserve units have run the railway system since the last active Army unit was shut down in the 1970s. Railroad soldiers will work along other units to move required cargo to and from Joint Base Langley Eustace to the port areas. And so they have a training history with the railroad. I would assume that they came down, but I cannot speak to that specifically. I hope that helps. Michael Bender knows much more about the military, I think, than many of us in terms of railroading. And I'll also say to Edward Rosenberg, I'm not sure if of the operational status of 610, and I would defer to anybody who has more knowledge of TVRM than I do. I've never been to TVRM, and it's not something I follow.
Michael asked, he said that he saw that one major support of the military from the railroad industry was through the intentional hiring of veterans. And the question was, does that relationship continue today?
I can't.
Again, I'd be surprised if it wasn't, but I don't know the direct answer.
I can't. No, I cannot speak authoritatively about it.
So if we were to go about doing a trip to Fort Eustace, would we, as you suggest, that would be kind of neat having it, the last one in 1970 and maybe the next one in a year or two. That would be kind of neat.
If you want to do that, I'd suggest you talk to the people at Army Steam,
Army
at the
Steam.
Military Railroad Society, because as I said, I know that they have had Santa Claus trains and operating trains during the holidays. There's probably someone there who would be eager to talk to the chapter.
You need to know that under a congressional act a number of years ago, many military establishments lost their identity, and Fort Eustace is one. Much of the activity other than the Transportation Corps that took place at Eustace was transferred to Fort Lee. Fort Eustace was combined into a joint base with Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, and it is now known as Joint Base Langley Eustace. The Air Force is the host. It no longer belongs to the Army. It belongs, the Army still runs Fort Eustace, but the overall command and logistics support of Eustace resides in the Air Force at Langley Air Force Base.
Thank you for that. Well, General, I wanted to ask you a more personal question. As the first director of this joint command, what were some of the challenges you had with putting together all of the different pieces and having a unified, collaborative, well-working unit?
I don't think we have time, but I will give you a thumbnail. The United States transportation came into existence over the objection of both the Army and the Navy. And it came into existence only because a lot of people said, well, it's something that absolutely has to happen. And that was true. The services each going their own way. In transportation, there was a lot of duplication and waste. Unfortunately, the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Navy Admiral William Crowell, saw the wisdom of a single transportation command. And by the dint of his office and his personality, he caused it to happen. And then putting it together was not easy. The original cadre of people, as a major general accustomed to a staff of quite a number of people, I had a staff of 8. And so it went. My immediate boss was the vice commander of the United States Transportation Command, was a crusty old vice admiral in the Navy, and our collective boss was an Air Force 4-star who commanded not only the U.S. Transportation Command, but also the Air Force's Air Mobility Command. And he, in that role, knew he had to work to stand up the U.S. Transportation Command. He did not want to be known as the man that gave away the Military Airlift Command from the Air Force. So there was a battle within the command, and of course the services drug their feet until Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And the lack of command and control authority on the U.S. Transportation Command meant that everything had to be coordinated, not directed, and it was a disaster. I, fortunately, had retired about 6 months earlier, so I sat on the sideline and watched the mayhem. But as a result of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, all the services recognized that it was an absolute essential to U.S. warfighting capability that we have this unified command. And now it is the premier showpiece command of the 8 or 9 unified commands. Unified commands being a command composed of all the services with staffs of each of the services, and usually they are geographic: European Command, Pacific Command, but the Transportation Command, of course, is located in the United States, but has arms everywhere. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very interesting, very interesting. So as we close, I wanted to ask each of you your most memorable or favorite or some railroad experience that you might want to share with us as being something that you'll recall.
Oh my gosh.
Well, both of you have a lot to choose from, and
Well, I'll start. My most recent railroad hands-on experience was as the Director of Operations and Logistics for the Transportation Command, I was invited to Omaha, Nebraska, home of Union Pacific, to address a symposium of the senior Union Pacific executives regarding the Transportation Command and our role and so forth. And they were very gracious and invited my wife to come along. And the remembrance of that trip is they gave us each a hard hat, mine with 2 stars and hers with 3. Where mine says Major General Jack, hers says the general's boss. And that's the way things are.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Oh, Bill, how about you?
Oh, I have so many that it's hard to pick one. I guess one of the most exciting was when I was working on the Dover Harbor with freeze watch, and that was an easy job. On the night when we hadn't yet drained out the regular water and put in the antifreeze, if the temperature was going to freeze, they had to have somebody on the car in case it started to freeze, so actions could be taken. And I was there asleep when all of a sudden I heard this thumping noise. Had no idea what it was, and got up and finally discovered that a hose had come off in the shower because of a faulty fitting, and this water was squirting out and banging back and forth in the shower, and I had to find a way to turn that off. Thankfully, Jim Lilly, telephone call to Jim Lilly got the answer, but that was, for me, I guess, a pretty frightening kind of thing.
Well, thank
And
you.
if I may,
You go ahead.
one more. I enlisted in the Air Force in 1948 in Kansas City, and my travel to basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, was by rail. Don't ask me the name of the railroad because I don't have a clue. Probably
Missouri,
well,
Kansas,
anyway.
Texas.
Sir?
Missouri, Kansas, Texas.
Yeah, the MKT, I'm sure it was. My next duty station was at Cheyenne, Wyoming, and I moved by rail. My next duty station was Davis-Monthan Air Force Base at Tucson, Arizona, and we moved by rail. In that case, because it was a day and a half trip, we were provided with Pullman accommodations. So for an 18-year-old kid, that was pretty special.
That's great. That's great. Well, we're very happy with our Pullman, and like I said earlier, there's an opportunity for those of you who might want to go to Chicago on the Dover Harbor. Those tickets are being sold for the Dover Harbor's been invited to Pullman Days in June, and that's going to be really exciting. The Dover Harbor is going to go back to its factory as a showcase piece, because in the last few years, the operations and maintenance group here under Jim Lilly has done a fantastic job. I mean, our beloved car is like a diamond. It sparkles. So we hope everybody will come out and see it. So Bill, Jack, thank you so much for this wonderful time and wonderful conversation. And
Our pleasure.
Just to remind our audience that these meetings are recorded. This recording will be uploaded to the DC NRHS YouTube channel. So if you want to see this again, find it there. And if you find this valuable, send your link to your friends and neighbors and tell us to join us at the next time. So we look forward to seeing you all back with us in our next presentation, to be decided soon. So thanks, everybody. And Jack, Bill, wonderful time. And good night to everybody on the phone.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
So I see that Tom, you're going to be at Apricot in Chicago. Yay, we'll get to see you in Pullman days.
When is the Pullman days?
It's the end of May, the beginning of June.
I might have an event that day.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be at the West Trolley meet, I think the weekend after that in Washington, Pennsylvania.
Okay, we want to thank your family, Bill, for joining us. Michael, Uncle Chuck. That was really a treat. And good to see everybody else. So thanks all, and we'll see you on another program talking about railroads and the history and preservation.
Have a
So
good night.
good night, all.
Good night.
Thanks again, Bill.
Good night.
Sure.
Jack has already signed off.
Okay, I'm signing out too. I'll say goodnight to my son and up, they've already left. Okay. So long now.
Good night, everybody.